Our exclusive coverage of National Signing Day 2014 continues. We welcome you back inside the Pushkar Center. Tony Caridi along with Jeff Culhane. Our first guest of our broadcast is Oliver Luck. We'll talk with Oliver in just a moment. Right now you see the recruiting class as we speak. You can see the top 6 names there from Howard down to Devontae James all in. And the people that have signed to this point include Drayvon Henry, Tyree Owens, Dante Angus, Jacob McCrary, Lamar Parker, Xavier Preston, and DeJuan Funderburk. And again, we'll be joined by the WVU assistant coaches, coordinator of recruiting, Ryan Dorchester, head coach, Dana Holgerson, all during our broadcast here. We're going to be with you until 1 o'clock this afternoon, and then Coach Holgerson will hold his annual press conference on signing day at 3 o'clock this afternoon, and you'll be able to watch that broadcast live here on the video stream at WVUsports.com. All right, our first guest, WVU's athletic director, Oliver Luck. Not only has he overseen recruiting here as the athletic director, one day you also literally signed your name on a letter of intent. That was back, okay, so we're talking late 78?
That would have been 1978.
78.
Would have been April
April
late, very late of 1978.
So it was back in April then?
Yeah.
It's changed so much. Let's talk about that, because I was teasing Oliver before we came on here and say, were you a 1-star, were you a 2-star? He was recruited so long ago, they didn't even have stars.
Well, I think the internet, right, has really changed a lot of how recruiting takes place and how kids are identified and ranked and all that sort of stuff. My recollection in the old days was that coaches at the college level went to high school coaches and said, you got a kid who can play? Would he be interested maybe in WVU or wherever? And there's a lot of much more word of mouth than there is now. There really weren't any recruiting services. People had to go pick up the Cleveland Plain Dealer or the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette or whatever local newspaper there was to figure out who was all conference or all city or all county or whatever it was. So it's fundamentally changed. And I think the process has moved up. I didn't sign my scholarship letter of intent until April of that spring. I was almost graduated from high school. Now, of course, we've got kids, on campus in January, when they could be finishing high school. So it's really moved up almost a full year.
Your recruitment, if I'm correct, Gary Stevens, did he specifically recruit you?
Gary Stevens, yes.
And so let's talk about your recruitment, because I find those stories are always interesting, because let's face it, you make a decision today, and one way or another, it is with you for the rest of your life. Now, whether or not you go through the distance or whether you transfer, whatever happens today is a significant milepost in your career. You had other opportunities, right? You had some Ivy League opportunities. West Virginia was involved. Talk about your recruitment, and ultimately, how did you make that decision?
Well, you're absolutely right. It is probably the most important decision that one of these kids makes, right, at this point in their lives. They're 17, maybe 18, sometimes only 16 when they make a commitment. So it's hugely important. We'll have major ramifications down the road for each one of those student athletes. And everybody's story is different. Mm-hmm. I mean, my class, we had some pretty good players coming out of Cleveland. Eldridge Dixon, who sadly passed away last year. Darryl Talley was part of that group. And if you ask Darryl, his story was completely different than Dick's story, or completely different than my story, because everybody's got a unique circumstance. In my case, I looked at a bunch of Ivy League schools. I went down to UVA for a recruiting trip, but decided that I really wanted to play big-time college football. And in that era, as an Ohio kid, even though I was recruited by Big Ten schools, they were still just running the ball. It was 3 yards in a cloud of dust. Woody was still at Ohio State. Bo was still at Michigan. So I really didn't want to go to the Big Ten, because as a quarterback, that was sort of a graveyard. But everybody has a different, unique story, and it's really fun as a class comes together and you get on campus and you start to train and work out. There's a real sense that even though you have a different story, and you got kids from the country, kids from the inner city, kids from the suburbs, quickly you come together and boy, you've got 25 of your best friends almost right off the bat. That's kind of a neat dynamic that takes place throughout the country.
And you're literally bonded for life. I mean, because when the guys come back now, I mean, yeah, you came from all different paths, but yeah, you guys will always be bonded together. So let's go full circle here then, Oliver. So you were recruited that way. Obviously, your son Andrew was also heavily recruited. As a parent now, then taking a look at it, when that process took place, what did you see in that whole process?
Well, I think it's harder for these kids because these decisions get magnified with all the attention that they get. Back in the old days, nobody was picking up hats and putting them on. I think I signed my scholarship paper sitting at my kitchen table and gave it to Coach Stevens, and he drove off and drove back to Morgantown and turned it into Coach Signetti. So I think there's more pressure on these kids. They've got more kids at school yapping in their ear. They've got more family and friends yapping in their ear. It's a tougher decision in many respects because it's made in somewhat of a public forum. Nonetheless, what kids need to learn, the hardest thing for them really, and I think many fans forget about this, sometimes it's hard for a 17-year-old kid to say no. Right? You got a coach coming in, there's all these great schools out there with great programs and great legacies and great facilities, and it's very difficult for a kid to say, Coach, I'm sorry, I'm not interested. When Andrew started his recruiting process, I told him, hey, if a school calls and you've got zero interest, tell them no. There's no sense, delaying it. Be fair to the school. If they don't think they can get you, then they're going to go after somebody else, and they don't lead them on. But it's tough for a 17-year-old kid in many respects to say, I'm sorry, Coach, I'm just not interested in State U or whatever.
That's absolutely true.
Oliver, from a coach's perspective, how do you think it's changed then with all the attention that is out there, like we've been discussing? What do you feel like as an athletic director now, coaches deal with the help maybe they receive, with the extra attention to it, and maybe also dealing with that from a negative standpoint in this day and age in the world of recruiting?
It's I think a more difficult job for coaches. They got to spend more time. I think there's more resources as well, right? That exist, which is kind of nice because the old days it really was a lot of word of mouth. There was a lot of word of mouth, a lot of trusted high school coaches that would steer a kid maybe towards school A or B or C. And now with the internet, it's all public, and I think as a result, there's a little bit more pressure on the coaches as well. But in the old days, I mean, they'd get in their Chrysler K cars and they'd drive all over Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Kentucky, Maryland, you name it, Virginia to get kids. And sometimes it was a real surprise who your teammates were, because all you'd see is a list. You'd see a high school name, Berwick High School, so-and-so. Okay, well, let's see what this kid's like. You didn't know if he was a big guy, small guy, black, white, Latino, whatever the case would be. There was a lot of unknowns. I think it was probably a little bit easier back in the old days to get a kid under the radar screen, compared to now where it's everybody sort of has a profile, whether it's a 2-star or a 3-star or whatever. They've been analyzed, until the cows come home.
And along that line, big picture stuff now. As athletic director, we are in a conference that is as pure as it is when it comes to trying to get national talent. Obviously, the likes of the Texases and Oklahomas, among others, in this conference. What's your charge as athletic director to make sure that West Virginia is and has the tools, all the tools that it's needed? As you look at that and as you talk with Dana Holgerson, what's needed here? Well,
I think this applies, number one, to all of our sports, right? And recruiting is not just a coach going out and talking to a young man or a young woman, and that's part of it, obviously, and there has to be some kind of a bond there. But recruiting involves everything we do with our football program or basketball or soccer or whatever it may be. That includes your infrastructure. Kids like bricks and mortar. We all know that, right? They show up on campus for the visit and they look around and say, "Oh yeah, nice weight room." It includes, where the kids are living in terms of dormitories or off-campus housing. It includes our nutrition program. It includes the strength coaches. It includes the academic part of the university. We talk about all these student athletes, and they got to go to school. They should go to school. They need to go to school. So I think the job of any athletic director is to make sure that all those components are where they need to be, right? And I'll give you an example. I was just talking to Mike Carey, women's basketball coach. Our team's in the top 20, playing very well. You watch all the games, Tony. And Mike said that they're recruiting 8 girls. He said all 8 of those girls are in the top 20 in the country in terms of recruits. And each one of those 8 girls has WVU in their top 3. He said, Oliver, we've never been that close before. To getting that kind of a talent. Maybe we get 1 or 2 over the years, but we're talking, we're in the hunt with 8 of the top 20 players in the country. I said, well, why is that the case, Mike? He said, well, two things. The Big 12 Conference, great basketball, right? Girls want to play because they know it's maybe the best basketball conference in the country in terms of the women's game. And secondly, a new basketball practice facility that just, is jaw-dropping when a young lady walks in there or a young man. So that's the same type of thing we have to do in all of the sports, football included, because these kids, make an emotional decision, but they do make it based on weight rooms and study areas and nutrition areas and where am I going to be living and the overall feel for the campus. So there's all those components that really matter. Coaches need to go out and recruit, and I think our coaches have done a really good job the past couple of years in putting good classes together. But my responsibility is to make sure all those component parts are working properly.
Geographically, when we first came into this Big 12 conference, some thought, well, a lot of these guys on this staff had Big 12 ties. We're going to jump into Texas. We're going to go in heavy in Texas and Oklahoma and get those guys there. You take a look at this class today, geographically, this is where West Virginia has always recruited. Has that been a concerted, you know what, let's stay where we're comfortable? West Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida, where we've always been getting players. Is that the route, even though we're the outlier geographically in the conference?
Well, I mean, I do think if you look at Ohio high school football, Pennsylvania high school football, it's changed a bit over the last 20, 30 years. There's still some really good players, right? Look at Ohio State's roster. Look at Penn State's roster. They still make a living where they've made a living for many, many years. So I don't think it's changed much in the sense that kids still want to go to school relatively close to home. 4, 5, 6 hour drive. It's tough to, I went through this with my kids, it's tough to be a plane flight away, right? Because A, it's expensive, B, you're relying on, good weather and all those types of things to get out and see your kids. So I think we will continue to, go to those places, our old hunting grounds where we've, as long as they're producing good high school players, right? Things have slipped a little bit, certainly in Western Pennsylvania, just because of the demography. The old Mon Valley schools don't produce the talent that they used to. Joe Montana is not coming out of Ringgold High School anymore, right? So we have to make sure we're going places where there's players who are talented enough to play, certainly in the Big 12. And I think because of the Big 12, we'll have a chance with a couple of Texas kids or maybe a Mississippi kid or an Oklahoma kid. But I think the core of our recruiting classes in almost all the sports is going to be Ohio, Pennsylvania, right, Maryland, DC, suburban DC area, Baltimore, and then of course down to Florida. That seems like it's almost adjacent to West Virginia with as many kids as we're pulling out of the East Coast of Florida. And with Damon on the staff now, I think that'll only continue.
Yeah, the addition of Damon Cogdill, obviously with the tie to Miramar, outstanding to say the least in the game of recruiting. I wanted to, you mentioned the Big 12 Conference and how that footprint could slide around, but also the world of television today in college football and how that affects the world of recruiting, also can help with the change to the new league and things of that nature, provide more of a message for what West Virginia University has to offer.
Well, the Big 12's TV platform, Tony knows this better than anybody, the Big 12's TV platform is incredible. I used to get emails all the time when we were in the old Big East, from a Mountaineer alumnus down in Tampa, and I can't get this basketball game on TV, or I can't get this football game, and what's the matter? I don't get those anymore because virtually every game we have is on national television, a national platform. In basketball next year, I think ESPN will carry every one of the Big 12 basketball, men's basketball games. That's incredible. So there is great exposure, and as you guys know from talking to these kids, every one of these young men comes in and thinks he is going to play in the NFL, right? Now, that's not reality. That'll play out over the next 4 or 5 years, and that's a good thing that they think they can play in the NFL. They're confident in their abilities, and they want to go take it to the next level. So having the ability to play on a national platform and play in big games and play, teams like Oklahoma or Texas or legacy programs that, seemingly are always going to be in the top 10, top 15, top 20 is a good thing for us. I think that's helped us upgrade what we need to do and get players like Dravon Henry from Aliquippa, right? #1 rated kid in Pennsylvania. I'm not sure when the last time we had the #1 rated Pennsylvania kid coming to Morgantown, but that's a good thing, And thanks to Charles Fisher, who paved the way, or Cedric Thomas back in the old days, some great quips that came down from Aliquippa to Morgantown. But that's an indication, I think, of of what we need as a staff and as a university and as a department to do, not just in football, but in all the sports.
Yeah, and speaking of Drayvon Henry, just an update you, speaking of Aliquippa, Jaleel Fields, he has officially signed his letter of intent, and Jaleel Fields is in. We're with WVU Athletic Director Oliver Luck. You attend and you watch the Mountaineers, obviously, home and away. So now you've had 2 seasons, Oliver, to watch Big 12 Conference football against the Mountaineers. Give me put on your general manager's hat here from a personnel standpoint. And what are you seeing and where do we need to be from a talent perspective, where we're not and where do we need to go?
I think you talked about it before you went to the break, which is having a full complement of student athletes, right? I think we ended the Orange Bowl, I might be off by 1 or 2. I think we ended the Orange Bowl game with only 61 or 62, whatever number of scholarship players. That's almost like being on probation. Well, it's worse than being on probation in terms of not having a full body count. So I think in this conference, with the talent level that's there, with the speed of the game, I think you really need a solid group of 85. Nobody's ever going to be quite at the 85. A kid may quit, may leave, may not make it academically, who knows. But we're getting very close as we start spring ball to that number. And that's hugely important because as you see from watching, whether it's Baylor or other schools, they'll rotate a full defensive line and they'll rotate linebackers in. The pace of the game is such that it's hard to play 90 snaps anymore. I would have loved to have done that back in the old days, but we were lucky to get 60 in. Right. So I think depth is number one, and of course you want quality depth. You want guys who can play, and I think that that's what I see as I looked around our conference. We lost some tight games, right? 2 overtime games this past season, and that to me comes down to a couple 3 plays in the 4th quarter, and if you've got guys who still have some fresh legs and aren't absolutely worn down, particularly early in the year when it's hot and 95 degrees on the turf, all that sort of stuff. So I'm glad to see our numbers get back up to a point where we've got intra-squad competition during practice. That's so important. People don't realize, how important it is for a kid to go to practice and say, I better bust my butt today and really give my all because I got a guy behind me. He's fighting for my job, and that makes you a better player.
No question.
We historically, over the many, many years, with some exceptions, Wolf's senior class being one of them, we historically haven't had that much intra-squad competition. That's very important. I think we're getting to the point now where there's going to be a lot of contested positions, and that's actually a good thing because you don't want to go in and say, all right, Luck's the starting quarterback, and not much behind him. So, we know, you go through there and you get a little bit complacent because you realize nobody's on your tail.
Oliver, speaking of quarterback, one of the scholarship quarterbacks in this class, Skylar Howard, a junior college transfer out of Riverside in Southern California, here early on campus right now. From a quarterback yourself, from that perspective, how important can that be, in your opinion, to get in early and especially with Dana's system, get the opportunities and the reps and the film work early on before your first spring period to get more acclimated?
Very important. He's a great kid, great work ethic. He's out there every morning at 7 throwing in the indoor practice facility since we got a foot of snow out on Mountaineer Field. But it's important to be able to get adjusted and sort of figure out where things are in Morgantown, get used to your new teammates, start to develop some bonds. So I'm delighted that, particularly for Skylar, that we were able to get him in early. I think for any quarterback it's very helpful because you do just get a leg up in terms of figuring out things on campus and with the program.
Looking ahead to this coming season, there was news just 2 days ago that we made a move within the schedule for the Oklahoma game. It was originally scheduled for the 27th of September. It's been moved up to the 20th of September, so 1 week earlier. How did that move come about? What was the reasoning behind it?
The simple answer is ESPN asked us to move it. And we looked at the schedule. Dana believed it'd be actually a plus for us because it gives us a bye, after 4 games as opposed to a bye after 3. Does that make much of a difference in the grand scheme of things? Who knows? Hard to say. But we've always operated from the position that if ESPN or Fox, both of whom are paying the conference a lot of money for the conference's football and basketball television rights, if they come and ask us and make a reasonable request, and if it's not a downer for us or a negative, we'll try to comply. And if you saw the release, there were like 6 schools that had to move a game. You know, Tulsa had to move their game against Oklahoma. We moved against them. Tulsa played somebody else. And, you know, it's sort of a cascading effect. So we try, where possible, where it doesn't affect us negatively, to, you know, to abide by any wishes that ESPN or Fox may have.
Do you have any indication or lean from ESPN as to whether it would be ESPN 1 or 2 at this point?
No, don't know. But I think they're planning on, you know, one of their national platforms. It should be a pretty competitive game, as it has been the last couple of years. You know, those WVU Sooner games have been pretty. Unfortunately, we ended up on the wrong side. You know, first year by 1 point, and then last year out in Oklahoma. But I think that'll be another tight competitive game.
You were also on the first ever college football playoff selection committee. What's that been like so far, and what do you feel like that's going to do to the sport of college football?
You know, I think it's an improvement over the BCS system. Everybody complained about, you know, computers. And so the idea was to bring the human element back into the mix, and there'll still be lots of data that we're going to look at, but there's, you know, 13 of us who can sort of hash out those issues. You know, we haven't made any tough decisions yet because the season hasn't started yet. We did meet a couple of weeks ago and sort of set the framework for things like recusals and how do we get all this data in terms of all the teams in the country, when the first voting takes place, et cetera. So, but those are relatively easy decisions to make. You know, we're basically modeling ourselves after the basketball selection committee. Mike Tranghese, the former Big East commissioner and a basketball guy at heart, as you know, Tony. Mike's on that board. Mike's been very helpful in steering us towards sort of the good things that the basketball committee did. So in a sense, we're going back a little bit to how it used to be with college athletics. And even though football's always been this funny outlier, first it was the writers declaring a mythical national champion, then we had the BCS, which was an improvement, certainly, and I think this will be even a step up. So I think it's going to be very popular. I think those 2 semifinal games are going to be enormously popular. The TV ratings will be through the roof, and I think it enhances the final. Because you're going to be able to see the teams at the end of the season that really do have to make it through a tough semi-final game to make it to that championship. So I'm excited about it.
So you met a couple of weeks ago. What's the chronology now? How often do you plan to get together? Will it be conference calls? Will it be from now for every once in a month, and then obviously increase once the season begins? What's the program?
We have a meeting scheduled in early April. Then we have a summer sort of retreat that we have, and then we kick it off. We won't be issuing the first ranking, 1 through 25, until I believe it's October 20, the weekend of October 27th, and then every week thereafter. So we'll meet live. We discussed, you know, having conference calls. Condoleezza Rice was very adamant. She said, listen, you know, we have a sort of a public trust with this new playoff committee. I know, you know, folks aren't crazy about getting on the plane and flying to Dallas, which is where we meet, but, you know, we need to go overboard in terms of face-to-face to make sure that the public really realizes this is a lot of work. People are taking this seriously. We're not filling out some top 25 and asking the GA to fax it in Sunday morning at 12 because I've got, you know. So we're trying to avoid, I think, some of the sloppiness almost that existed in the past. So it's going to be a lot of FaceTime with some pretty interesting people. The good news is it's a great group of folks. Archie Manning's on that committee. You got obviously the 5 athletic directors from the 5 big conferences. Ty Willingham, the former Notre Dame and UW and Stanford coach. Just some great people on there that really, Tom Osborne. You know, when he talks, like E.F. Hutton, everybody listens, right? Because he's sort of the eminence grease, if you will, in that room. So it's a good group of people, and it should be a fun experience. But more importantly, I think it's a good step for college football.
A lot of good teams at the end of this season. Did you find yourself kind of mentally going through it with the way the season ended this year, and maybe if we were doing it this season, maybe this is how I would select the 4 teams with the way the year ended?
Yes, and I can't tell you what I would have done because we sort of sworn, you know, not to replay this past season, but it was hard not to, right? Yeah. As somebody who loves college football, and you watch the last couple of weeks play out, and you watch the championship weekend, and then you watch the bowl games, and you see actually at the end of those bowl games, you know, for example, the Rose Bowl with Michigan State winning, that was a big deal, right? I mean, Michigan State really proved they were the class of the Big Ten, obviously knocking off Stanford. So, but we didn't really discuss those in any formal fashion. But I think every one of the members sort of watched very closely and said, you know, what if? What would I do here? What bit of information would maybe make it easier to make that decision, you know, from a number 4 to a number 5 or number 3 to number 4?
Would you imagine that had you been in operation this season and that pairing came out to be, Auburn and Florida State with the dramatic ending of that game. You guys would have been heralded as, see, that's the answer, right? So make sure you don't give us a dud next year.
You know, more often than not, the BCS got it right.
Yeah, you're right.
You know,
I agree with you.
But then you look at the Super Bowl, right? You look at the NFL, which is, you know, a logical playoff system. Hard to argue with how the NFL does it. We've had great Super Bowls, right? We had a nice string of, I don't know how many in a row, 5, 6, 7. And then before that, if you remember going back now to the 90s, we had about 10 totally one, like we'd had, you know, this past Sunday, just one-sided games where people say, oh my gosh, this is, you know, this is not, the Broncos just can't, you know, fight their way out of a wet paper bag in this game. So we'll have, I'm sure, really good championship, semis and championship games, and some years we may have a dud, you know. That's just sort of the way it is. But I think overall it's an improvement, and I think the chatter around, you know, the last 4 or 5 weeks when the sort of 1 through 5, 1 through 6 begins to solidify will be really interesting to follow.
I agree. Oliver, we know you've got assignments here this morning. We really appreciate your time. Thanks so much for stopping by.
Thank you for having me, and good luck with the, what is it, 5 hours you're doing this morning?
On we go toward 1 o'clock. Very good. Along with Athletic Director Oliver Luck, Jeff Culhane, we invite you to stay tuned. We'll update the recruiting list. We'll be joined by WVU assistant coaches when we return. Stay with us. Our coverage of National Signing Day being presented by United Bank. We'll be back.